The first thing I noticed wasn't the sea. It wasn't even the heat or the salt clinging to my skin as we stepped out of the taxi. It was the way he looked at me. Just a second too long. Just enough to make me aware of my legs, of the neckline of my summer dress, of the way the fabric stuck to my back from the flight. My husband was busy paying the driver. The house loomed ahead, bathed in late afternoon light. White stucco walls, olive trees along the edge, a terrace that promised quiet mornings and dinners that would stretch into slow, wine-drenched nights. It was meant to be a break from everything. 3 of us. A short escape to the coast. A rented villa. The sea. Simplicity. No schedules. No pressure. Just us. But already I could feel the imbalance. It was subtle, like a chair with one leg a fraction shorter than the others. You don't notice it at first, but then you sit, and something shifts beneath you. You shift too, without meaning to. He carried the smaller suitcase, the one I always packed last. Swimwear, underwear, sandals, sunscreen. I watched the way his shirt clung to his arms. I told myself it was nothing. The heat. The stress of travel. But something in me was too awake, too aware. Inside, the house was exactly what we'd seen in the photos. Warm tiles, arched windows, a long wooden dining table open to the terrace. The bedrooms were upstairs. There was a small staircase that split the 2 wings, one side for us, the other for him. He dropped my suitcase at the base of the stairs without saying a word. We settled in with the ritual of all vacations. Unpacking, claiming hangers, opening windows. My husband was already in the kitchen, asking where the coffee filters were. I stood in front of the mirror in our room, peeling off the dress that now felt too tight, too warm. I stared at my reflection in the heat-stained glass. My body looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. Later, we sat together on the terrace. The air was heavy with the smell of rosemary and distant charcoal smoke from someone else's grill. My husband scrolled through his phone, replying to something from work. I sipped chilled wine that had too much acid, feeling it scratch the inside of my throat. He joined us after his shower, towel-damp hair and loose linen shirt. He didn't say much, just nodded, took a seat across from me. The candlelight flickered between us, carving shadows on his face. There was a quiet there I didn't trust. Not silence, not absence. Presence. Thick and unspoken. When my husband stood to take a call, leaving his half-empty glass on the table, the air between us tightened like a wire. He didn't lean closer. He didn't speak. But he looked at me, not with curiosity, with recognition. "You're not the same when he's not around," he said. I felt my stomach twist. Not in guilt, but in some other unnameable place. A pulse under the skin. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. Just stood, stretched, and walked inside. And I sat there, fingers tightening around the stem of my glass, listening to the quiet return of the sea. That night, I lay beside my husband in the dark. He reached for me in that automatic way I'd learned to predict. Half asleep, half routine. His hand on my hip, his breath already slowing. I let him. The same way I let him drive, or choose the restaurant, or answer for me when the waiter asked, still or sparkling. But my mind was elsewhere. Not on what happened, but on what hadn't. The way a door can remain closed, and yet you still hear wind pressing against it. That pressure, that waiting. In the morning, I would find myself in the kitchen earlier than usual. He would be there too. I knew it already. Not because we planned it, but because something in both of us had already decided. The kitchen was quiet in the early hours, still shaded from the heat that would arrive by mid-morning. The tiles were cool beneath my bare feet, and I wore a thin robe cinched loosely at the waist. It was one of those items I never wore at home, something bought on a whim, soft and light, with lace tracing the hem. At home, it felt too indulgent. Here, it felt right, though I didn't ask myself why. I wasn't expecting him to be there, but I should have known. He stood by the counter, barefoot, shirtless, pouring water into the kettle. The morning light filtered through the wide window, painting golden stripes across his back. I froze in the doorway, not out of surprise, but because something in the stillness between us had changed. I no longer felt invisible. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge me without speaking. There was something unnerving in how calm he seemed. My robe shifted as I moved to the other side of the kitchen. I reached for a mug, trying to keep my hands from trembling. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was thick, dense, full of something neither of us dared name. "Didn't sleep?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shrugged. The fan kept rattling. It was a simple exchange, but it echoed too loudly in the hush of the kitchen. I filled my cup with coffee, took a sip, and winced. It was still too hot. I set it down on the counter. When I turned, he was looking at me. Not just looking, seeing. As if I were something to be read, page by page, and he was deciding where to begin. I felt a strange heat rising through my skin, though the room was still cool. I noticed his eyes dip, just for a moment, to the line of my collarbone. There was no shame in it, no apology, only quiet certainty. He moved closer to place his mug beside mine, and in that brief shift of movement, the space between us disappeared. I felt his breath against my neck before I even realized he was that near. I didn't move. Something inside me locked in place. Not frozen, just waiting. His hand reached toward the counter, brushing mine, and I should have pulled away. It would have been so easy. A simple movement. But I didn't. I let his skin rest against mine, still warm from the kettle, still damp from sleep. The touch wasn't bold. It wasn't hungry. It was patient. As if he were asking a question without words, and I, without meaning to, answered. We both leaned in at the same time. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't a mistake. His lips found mine the way the tide finds the shore. Inevitable. Soft, then deepening. I felt his hand at my waist, not gripping, not demanding, just holding, like he wanted to remember the shape of that moment. My body betrayed me. It didn't hesitate. It leaned into him, opened, answered back. The kiss was warm, real, without the polite hesitation of stolen moments. It was not practiced or timid. It was as if we had kissed before in another life, and our mouths remembered what we had forgotten. Then came the sound of steps on the stairs. We broke apart like children caught in a lie, and I moved quickly, too quickly, grabbing my mug with fingers that shook slightly. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. My heart pounded in my chest, not from guilt, but from the shocking clarity of desire. My husband entered the room a moment later, rubbing his eyes, dressed and humming something low under his breath. He greeted us both casually, stepping between us to reach for the juice. The man I had just kissed stepped back, leaned against the counter, and asked him something about the plan for the day. I stood near the sink, pretending to sip my coffee, tasting nothing. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small logistics. Breakfast on the terrace, a drive into the town to pick up more groceries, light conversation at lunch. I answered questions, smiled at strangers, adjusted my sunglasses in shop windows, but inside I wasn't with them. I kept replaying the moment in the kitchen. The way he didn't hesitate. The way my body had answered so easily, so naturally. There had been no fight in me, only surrender. I changed twice before dinner, finally settling on a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was linen, pale blue, with thin straps and a slit that felt too high. Too much, but I wore it anyway. I let my hair down. I applied a shade of lipstick my husband once said was too bold. I told myself it was for the evening, for the atmosphere. But I knew the truth. He noticed. At dinner, he didn't look at me the way he had in the kitchen. He didn't need to. I could feel it. It was in the weight of silence between questions. In the way he passed the wine bottle, letting his fingers linger against mine a second too long. My husband, unaware, talked about work, about a possible extension of our trip, about how good it was to finally unwind. I nodded, added comments when needed. I played my part. But inside, I was already somewhere else. Later, when we returned to the villa and the night crept in with the scent of salt and pine, I sat alone on the terrace while they both went to their rooms. The candle on the table flickered low, the wine in my glass untouched. I wanted to feel guilt, but I didn't. What I felt was a hunger I hadn't known in years. Not for him, for myself. For the woman I became in that kitchen. The one who didn't flinch. The one who answered. The third morning began with a strange lightness. Not happiness. Something more like internal disorientation. As if a part of me that had been resisting for years had finally gone quiet. I woke before my husband, lying on my back, staring at the white ceiling of our bedroom, trying to locate guilt. I searched for it carefully, like someone patting their pockets for keys they're sure they've lost. But there was nothing. No panic. No reckoning. Just a fact. It had happened. And no matter how cliché it might sound, it was painfully clear. It hadn't been a mistake. It wasn't a fleeting impulse. It was a door I had chosen to open. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to wake him. The fan spun above us with its usual hum, moving the curtains just enough to hint at the sea breeze waiting outside. I moved toward the suitcase by the window and pulled out a dress I hadn't planned to wear on this trip. A soft, sand-colored one that clung in just the right places and carried a subtle scent of a perfume I hadn't used in months. It was the same dress he had once noticed, last summer, on another trip, another quiet town. He told me then that I looked tender and dangerous in it. The phrase had stayed with me. Strange, contradictory, but somehow accurate. Like something he saw in me that I hadn't allowed myself to see. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Breakfast things were still tucked away, the kitchen untouched. I stepped out onto the terrace barefoot, holding a mug of coffee, and let the early light warm my shoulders. There was a stillness to the morning that made every sound sharper. The rustling of leaves, the distant cry of gulls, the soft creak of a wooden chair behind me. He joined me a few minutes later, not announcing himself, just easing into the space beside me. We didn't speak at first. I could feel him sit down, his body folding into the chair, his presence altering the air like a shift in pressure before a storm. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Not yet. We drank our coffee in silence, staring out at the horizon. The sea was calm, almost silver in the morning light. I felt the heat of his glance on the side of my face. I knew it without seeing. I sipped slowly, tasting little. My husband appeared behind us 10 minutes later, rubbing sleep from his face, already dressed in the same linen shirt he wore the night before. He kissed my hair absently, asked if we were still up for a walk before lunch. I said yes too quickly. Guilt hadn't arrived, but caution had, like a shadow that stretches longer before the sunset. The three of us walked together along the coastal path, a worn stone trail edged with lavender and seagrasses. I forced conversation, made comments about the color of the sky, the shape of the clouds, anything to fill the spaces where something else was growing. He walked beside me, close enough that his arm brushed mine when the trail narrowed. Each accidental contact felt deliberate, measured. My skin reacted before I could think. My husband took pictures on his phone, of the water, the rocks, us. He laughed once, showing me a blurry shot where the wind had caught my hair. I smiled, said something about deleting it. But the image stayed with me. Me, laughing, hair wild, eyes half closed. Not the woman I'd been pretending to be for years. The woman I was slowly becoming again. At lunch, we sat under a canopy in a small seafood place by the harbor. Boats swayed behind us, and the smell of grilled fish drifted through the salt, thick air. I watched him across the table, the way he wiped condensation from his glass, the way his fingers rested on the edge of his plate, motionless. He didn't look at me too often. But when he did, it was with that same quiet certainty. The one that said he knew, not just what we'd done, but what we still would do. My husband, oblivious, ordered wine for the table and began planning the evening. He suggested we stay longer, maybe extend the trip by a few days. I watched his mouth move, his hands gesturing with excitement. I listened, nodded, but I felt something tighten in my chest. Longer meant more time to lie, more time to pretend. Later that evening, while my husband took a nap upstairs, I went to the terrace again. This time, alone. I stood at the edge, barefoot on the warm tiles, watching the shadows stretch across the hills. I didn't hear him come up behind me until he spoke. "You've changed," he said, voice low. I turned, heart rising to my throat. "Have I?" I tried to make it light. It came out too brittle. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded toward the house. "When he's not around, you breathe differently." I said nothing. He stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but enough to feel. The tension between us was no longer a question. It had become a current. And then he left me there, on the edge of the terrace, heart beating against my ribs, wondering how much longer I could keep pretending nothing was happening. I knew one thing for certain. It wouldn't be long. It started with a dress. Not the moment of weakness in the kitchen, not the brush of fingertips, not the stolen looks or silences that buzzed louder than conversations. No. It started with the moment I pulled that dress from the back of the closet in the guest room where I had moved some of my things. I said it was because our bedroom was too warm in the afternoons, that I liked the light in the other room. He had offered to switch rooms, even joked about letting me borrow the better view. No one questioned it. I needed space, I said. And everyone accepted that. The dress had been folded at the bottom of the suitcase, half forgotten. Thin white cotton, open back, short hem. I hadn't worn it in years, maybe not since before I got married. Too revealing now. Too suggestive. But when I slipped it on that afternoon, the fabric clinging softly to my hips and revealing more of my legs than I would normally show, I didn't second-guess it. I didn't hesitate. I wanted to be seen. I stood in front of the mirror in the guest room for a long time, not adjusting anything, letting it fit the way it did. My reflection wasn't unfamiliar, but it wasn't entirely mine either. There was something in the set of my shoulders, the curve of my spine, the tilt of my head that felt different. Like I was remembering something, re-inhabiting a version of myself I had buried under years of compromise, comfort, and politeness. I added earrings I hadn't worn in months, brushed perfume behind my knees and at the base of my throat. The scent bloomed subtly in the warm air, mingling with the salt that drifted in through the open window. The dinner was simple. Grilled vegetables, cold pasta, wine, chilled just enough. My husband was the one cooking. He liked the outdoor kitchen, said it made him feel useful. I let him be useful. When I stepped onto the terrace, both of them were already there. My husband at the grill, focused on his tongs, his rhythm. Him, seated, half-turned, wine glass in hand. And when his eyes landed on me, something passed between us that neither of us masked. No smile, no polite reaction. Just quiet, open recognition. The silence that followed my entrance wasn't awkward. It was reverent. I took a seat, legs crossed slowly, deliberately. He said nothing, just watched. My husband, eventually turning to set a bowl on the table, complimented the dress with a distracted grin. "Haven't seen that one in a while," he said, already moving on to ask if the pasta was seasoned enough. But his brother hadn't looked away. The evening light was golden, the kind of light that makes everything appear softer than it is. We ate slowly, drank slower. Conversation moved lazily. Weather, the market, a couple they'd seen earlier who apparently looked like someone from high school. I nodded, responded when needed, but I was aware of every inch of my skin, aware of how the dress shifted when I leaned forward, aware of how many times I caught his glance skimming the line of my neck, the dip of my collarbone. At one point, I reached for the wine and he stood to pass it to me. His hand brushed mine. Not accidental, not too obvious, just enough for my fingers to feel his heat. And as he stepped behind me to return to his seat, he placed a hand lightly on my bare back. No words, no hesitation. Just his palm, the soft pressure, the slow drag of heat across my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I let it happen. My husband stood shortly after to fetch dessert. Something from the freezer, prepackaged, store-bought, but he'd made a point to call it our little tradition. I stayed seated. So did he. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The language had changed. When my husband returned, the moment dissolved. Not entirely, not cleanly, but enough to tuck it away. We ate in the fading light, spoons scraping plastic, laughter too loud and just off rhythm. I watched my husband as he talked, as he leaned back in his chair with the same familiar ease, completely unaware that the space beside him was no longer safe. Later that night, after we'd all gone to our rooms, I stood in front of the mirror again. The dress hung loose on a hanger now, its shape still warm with the memory of my body. I stood in my underwear, bare feet on cool tiles, the faint scent of wine and grilled rosemary clinging to my hair. I touched the place on my back where his hand had rested. It burned. Not painfully. Not even physically. But something in me had shifted again. I wasn't wondering anymore if it would happen again. I wasn't waiting for guilt or shame or the trembling hesitation I used to associate with the word betrayal. What I felt was clarity. Desire, yes, but also something deeper, more dangerous. I wanted to be seen again. I wanted more than just touches in passing and glances over dinner. And now I knew he did too. But we still hadn't spoken about it. Not a word. And somehow that made it all more real, more urgent. Like a wire pulled tighter each time we avoided what we both knew. I lay down that night next to my husband, who reached for me out of habit. I turned toward him, let him pull me close. But all I could think of was the heat of a hand on my back and the look that said he knew exactly what he'd done, and that he would do it again. And the most terrifying part? I wanted him to. We hadn't planned to go anywhere that day. It was supposed to be another slow afternoon. Maybe a swim, a walk into town in the late evening, dinner under the terrace roof. But sometime after breakfast, after my husband had pulled out his laptop to take a work call that wouldn't take long, a change rippled through the stillness. He was standing near the pool, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun, already raising his voice at the connection. Was in the kitchen, rinsing fruit I didn't plan to eat, when I heard the suggestion float through the open door. "We could drive down to the market in the next town," he said, stepping inside, phone still pressed to his ear. "There's that wine shop you liked last time, and we're almost out of fruit." I turned toward him. "Now?" "Yeah, it's a short drive. You can go, take the car. He'll go with you." He nodded toward his brother, who had just appeared in the doorway behind him. "I just need half an hour to finish this and send a few things off." It happened so naturally that I didn't even have time to protest. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for being understanding, then turned back outside, phone already reconnecting. And just like that, we were alone again. By the time I changed clothes, he was already in the car, engine running, windows rolled down to let in the ocean breeze. I wore a loose button-down dress, light blue, with sleeves I pushed to my elbows, and sandals that laced up my calves. My hair was pinned up, and I wore only a touch of makeup. Just enough, just in case. The drive was quiet at first. The road wound gently along the cliffs, dipping toward the sea and rising again into olive groves. I kept my hands in my lap. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, fingers tapping a rhythm I couldn't place. I noticed things I hadn't before. How he drove without tension. How he hummed faintly with the music on the radio. How he glanced at me only when the road straightened. His presence was calming and disarming at once. I didn't know what to do with the feeling. "You don't have to talk," he said suddenly, eyes still on the road. I wasn't planning to. I answered too quickly. He smiled, just the corner of his mouth twitching, but said nothing more. The town was small, its streets narrow and sun-bleached. We parked near the market and wandered through the stalls without speaking much. I touched peaches I didn't buy, smelled herbs bundled with twine, pretended to look for wine I already knew we wouldn't find here. Everything felt like stalling, like steps taken around something too hot to approach directly. Eventually, we bought a bottle of something cold and dry, a few oranges and a bag of soft white cheese wrapped in paper. We sat in silence on a stone wall near the harbor, the bag between us. The sun was high, and I could feel sweat collecting at the base of my neck, between my shoulder blades. He didn't look at me. Not right away. But his shoulder touched mine, and when I didn't move, he turned. There was a pause. A moment suspended like the breath before thunder. And then he kissed me. It was different this time. Not rushed, not testing. It was slower, certain. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission but waits to be answered. His hand found my waist, fingertips pressing lightly through the fabric of my dress. My hand rested on his knee and I didn't pull away. I remember the warmth of his lips, the salt of the sea still clinging to his skin, the faint scent of sweat and sun on his neck. I remember thinking, this is happening. Not in a fantasy. Not in the dark. Not behind a closed door. Here. In daylight. In silence. In a place where anyone could see if they looked. But no one looked. We broke apart only when the wind shifted, carrying a burst of laughter from a passing family. I stood up too quickly, brushing imaginary dust from my dress, cheeks flushed. He didn't reach for me again. He didn't need to. The line had been crossed long ago. This was just the next step forward. On the drive back, we said little. But the silence had changed again. It was no longer heavy. It was charged. I watched the sea blur past the window and tried not to think about how easy it had become to want him. When we returned to the villa, my husband was on the terrace, laptop closed, sunglasses on, feet propped on a chair. He greeted us cheerfully, asked if the market was crowded. I nodded, held up the bag of wine and fruit, smiled. He took the bag from my hands, kissed my forehead, thanked me for taking care of everything. And in that moment, standing between the man I had kissed and the man I had married, I felt completely split. As if I existed in two bodies, two lives, both running parallel but never touching. And I didn't know which one belonged to me anymore. That evening, as we prepared dinner together, I caught glimpses of myself in the glass of the oven door, in the reflection of the window. I saw a woman who looked calm, controlled, perfectly placed. But I knew better. I could still feel his breath against my skin, still hear the sound of his voice whispering nothing but presence. After dinner, while my husband cleared the plates, I stepped out onto the terrace, wineglass in hand. He joined me a few minutes later, standing beside me in the dark. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there close enough for our arms to touch. And then, softly, he said, "You're not pretending anymore." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because he was right. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days that followed blurred into one another, as though time had loosened its grip on us, letting moments slip past without clear shape or structure. There was no confrontation, no escalation. Just an unbearable stillness layered over every action, every word, every pause. It wasn't a question of if anymore. The question had become when and how and what would break first, me, him, or the fragile illusion we had all agreed to maintain. My husband seemed lighter than usual, perhaps buoyed by the sun and the slowing of his usual routine. He started sleeping later, taking naps in the afternoon, talking more during meals. He praised the food, complimented my dresses, brought back little things from the market as if trying to prolong the feeling of vacation. He had no idea what he was preserving was already fractured. One evening, he reached for me in bed. It wasn't urgent, but it was clear. A gesture that came from habit. Yes, but also from desire. Maybe the first in a long while. I didn't move away. I didn't want to humiliate him or myself with avoidance. I let it happen, but my body, though obedient, felt numb. Every touch reminded me of the way I no longer responded. Not out of cruelty, not out of rejection, just absence. He kissed me, his mouth warm against mine, and I closed my eyes and let my mind drift. I tried to focus on the physical sensation, on the familiarity of his skin, the comfort of his weight. But nothing lit up. No heat, no trembling, just the echo of what it once was. I was watching myself from somewhere else. From the woman who now felt alive only when another man entered the room. Afterward, I lay on my side, listening to his breathing slow as he drifted into sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the way desire had changed shape in my life. Once, it had been a flash. Unpredictable. Blinding. Then it became a duty. A rhythm. And now it was an ache. Constant and quiet. Triggered not by touch, but by glance, proximity, breath. The next morning, I sat alone on the terrace before anyone woke up. The sea was a dull silver, the sky overcast, the air heavy with the scent of an approaching storm. I wore one of my older robes, soft cotton, nothing suggestive. I wanted to disappear into the morning, to pretend nothing had shifted. But even the way the wind moved across my bare feet reminded me of what I had become. Porous, changed. He joined me not long after. His footsteps were lighter than his brother's. He never cleared his throat, never made noise to announce himself. He simply arrived. He sat beside me, silent at first. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly. "You're avoiding me." I turned toward him. "I'm trying not to burn everything down." His eyes stayed on the horizon. Too late for that. We didn't speak again, but everything that needed to be said was there, in the stillness between us. I finished my coffee. He stood and walked away. I stayed seated, heart pounding without any relief. That afternoon, we all went swimming. My husband suggested it. Said the water would help with the heat, which had grown oppressive. I wore a simple black swimsuit, nothing provocative, but I felt his eyes on me the moment I stepped outside. Not hungry, not possessive, just captivated. We swam, splashed, laughed. To anyone watching, we were just 3 people enjoying the sea, but I felt like I was drowning slowly beneath every gesture. When I climbed the ladder back onto the stone deck, I felt his hand brush my lower back, steadying me, supposedly. I didn't pull away. My skin buzzed for hours afterward. That evening, the silence returned. My husband worked late on his laptop, and I found myself sitting at the long table on the terrace again, fingers resting on the rim of a glass I hadn't touched. He sat across from me, half in shadow, legs stretched out, shirt unbuttoned at the throat. His foot brushed mine once under the table. A mistake. But he didn't move it. Neither did I. I kept telling myself to end it. To leave the table, to retreat upstairs, to lock the door and sleep. But I didn't. I stayed. I watched the wind move the candle flame between us. I listened to the crickets and the faint music drifting up from the town. And I imagined what would happen if I stood, walked around the table, sat in his lap. I didn't move. But I thought about it so clearly, so vividly that my hands shook when I reached for the wine. He noticed. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and spoke softly. "I'm not asking you for anything." I met his gaze. "But you want something. I want you to stop pretending this isn't killing you." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the fan whir above me, its blades slicing the silence into restless pieces. My husband breathed beside me, deep and even. I turned toward the window and stared at the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Desire no longer felt like a threat. It felt like inevitability. And in the quiet of that long, breathless night, I stopped trying to outrun it. The morning was different, though nothing had visibly changed. The same sea stretching into silence, the same white walls of the villa glowing under the soft pressure of the sun, the same rhythmic creaking of the old wooden shutters swaying in the breeze. But underneath it all, something had shifted. A new kind of tension, quieter, heavier, settled over everything like fog. He avoided me. Not obviously, not with distance or coldness, but with a studied effort to keep our interactions brief, polite, and surrounded by the safe buffers of routine. He didn't linger on the terrace anymore. He helped clean up after meals, but didn't stay to sit. He only spoke when addressed. He watched, but only when he thought I wouldn't notice. And every time he left the room, something inside me collapsed a little further into itself. My husband, oblivious to the fracture widening between us, seemed content. He began talking more about extending our stay, said it would be good for all of us. We never take enough time to just be. He framed it as generosity, but I could see in the way he clung to the idea that he needed the illusion to stretch just a little longer. He didn't know what was cracking beneath his feet, but he could feel the ground softening. He just hadn't decided what to blame it on. By midday, the heat had thickened again, pressing into our skin with sticky insistence. The kind of heat that steals your will to move, to think, to pretend. My husband suggested a boat ride, said the coast looked different from the water, more alive. I declined with some excuse about needing rest. I saw the flicker of disappointment behind his sunglasses. He didn't press. He turned to his brother. "You coming?" he asked. He looked at me just for a second before nodding. "Sure." They left together. I watched them walk down the hill toward the marina, two silhouettes against the bleached stone and sky, moving in sync like nothing could be wrong between them. I stood at the edge of the terrace, fingers curled over the rail, heart pounding so hard I thought I might bruise from the inside. When they returned, the sun had started to drop. My husband was beaming, slightly sunburned, full of stories about dolphins and a hidden cove he wanted us all to visit the next day. He went upstairs to shower, his voice trailing off with cheerful commands about dinner and drinks. I stayed in the kitchen, hands deep in a bowl of water, rinsing greens I didn't care to eat. I didn't hear him enter behind me, but I felt the air shift. The kitchen window was open. The scent of thyme, ocean, and lemon hung in the air like something sacred. I turned and he was there. Not too close. Just inside the doorway. His shirt was damp with sweat from the walk back. His hair was mussed. His eyes met mine with something restrained but not extinguished. "You're punishing yourself," he said quietly. I blinked, surprised by the directness. But he was right. I was avoiding. Not him. Myself. The version of me I had allowed to surface. The one I had tried to suppress again, to fold back into the safe, obedient woman who kept everything together. I turned away from him, wiping my hands slowly on a towel. "You think this is easy for me?" I asked, not facing him. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. "No," he said after a pause. "I think it's tearing you apart." When I finally looked back, he hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed. The distance he'd tried to rebuild was already slipping. The air between us was loud with the things we hadn't done, hadn't said. There was no need to name them. They lived in the pauses, in the glances, in the way my body leaned against the counter, knees slightly bent, like it was bracing for impact. He stepped forward. One step, then another. I didn't move. The kiss, when it came, wasn't planned. It wasn't even inevitable. It was necessary, like breathing, like surrendering to gravity. His hand found my waist again, but this time with a kind of quiet desperation. My arms went around his neck without thought, and for a few suspended seconds, there was no villa, no husband, no daylight filtering through the kitchen window. There was only skin, mouth, weight, heat. We broke apart when we heard a noise from upstairs, the creak of the floorboards above the hallway, a door closing, water running. He stepped back, not in panic, but in restraint. "We can't keep," I began, but the words died. His voice was steady. "Then don't." He left the room. I stayed behind, staring at the half-washed vegetables, the water now still and cloudy, my hands trembling above the basin. That night, we sat together at dinner like nothing had happened. My husband talked about his plans for the next day. The boat again, a hike along the cliffs, maybe that seafood place we hadn't tried yet. I nodded, smiled. I poured wine. I asked questions. He answered everything with love, comfort, familiarity. But I wasn't listening. I was watching the man across the table who didn't look at me once, who kept his eyes on the bottle, on the plate, on the sky. And still, his silence was the loudest voice at the table. When we cleared the dishes, my husband offered to do everything. "You've been running the show since we got here," he said. "Take a break. Go lie down." I didn't argue. I went upstairs, closed the door behind me, and stood in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of plates and water and cutlery. I peeled off my clothes slowly, not out of seduction, but out of some need to feel bare again. I slipped into a silk slip I hadn't worn in years. It clung to me like second skin. I didn't know who I had become, only that I was no longer who I was before. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house breathe. And I waited. The silence in the villa that night felt alive. It wasn't peaceful, not soft or restful. It pulsed, like breath being held just beneath the surface of the floorboards. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the shutters, every distant sound from the marina twisted my nerves tighter. I sat still on the edge of the bed, legs pressed together, the hem of the silk slip brushing the backs of my knees. My hands rested on my thighs, unmoving. Waiting had become its own kind of tension, heavier, crueler, more intimate than the act itself. I didn't know what I was waiting for. A decision, maybe. Or the echo of my own restraint finally breaking. The window was open, and the room smelled of jasmine and sea brine. The breeze moved slowly, and even that felt watched. I could hear 2 doors in the hallway open and close. Soft, careful sounds. One set of steps moving away, toward the guest room. Another set, heavier, descending the stairs. I thought of following. I imagined the quiet of the kitchen again, the cool of the stone floor underfoot, the brush of his fingers on my back. But I didn't move. I let the images pass over me like waves. They didn't break. They just pulled, deep and endless. I lay back eventually, not to sleep, but to give my body somewhere to rest. I stared at the ceiling and tried to feel nothing. My skin still held the memory of his hands, his mouth, his voice low and near. Nothing had happened, not since the kiss in the kitchen, not in the literal sense. But everything had already happened, and my body wouldn't let me forget it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of cutlery, a breakfast being assembled. My husband had already left the bed, and sunlight poured in too bright through the slats of the shutters. I stayed in the sheets a little longer than usual. My skin was hot, but not from the sun. I pulled the sheet against my chest and closed my eyes. I could feel the ache of restraint in the pit of my stomach. Downstairs, the breakfast scene was cheerful. Too cheerful. My husband's voice carried through the kitchen, full of plans and brightness, like he'd slept through his own life and woken up with a burst of energy. He had made coffee, sliced fruit, laid everything out like a ceremony. He gestured toward the terrace, said we should eat outside. The sky was too beautiful, he insisted, to waste a single moment of it. I smiled and nodded, made sounds of approval, picked up a plate I didn't want to eat from. He appeared minutes later, rested, tanned in that white shirt he wore too often. He carried the folded napkins and the cutlery, and when he placed the fork beside my plate, his hand brushed mine. He didn't look up. He didn't speak, but my fingers remained cold even in the heat. We sat side by side, all 3 of us, watching the sea in what should have been peace. My husband toasted to long days and longer memories, raising his glass with exaggerated charm. I forced a laugh. He clinked both our glasses, took a long sip, and leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. I studied the tablecloth, the pattern of the embroidery, the way a drop of condensation rolled slowly down the stem of my glass. I didn't dare look up. He cleared his throat. Not loudly, not nervously, just enough. My husband turned to him. "Everything okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking." My husband laughed. "Dangerous." I smiled, but the air between us turned to smoke. Something was dissolving. Something quiet and final. Later, I walked alone through the town. I needed space, not to think, to feel. Thinking had become a trap. Thoughts circled themselves, always arriving back at the same point. This wasn't about one man or one mistake. It was about erosion, about the way years had passed through me, carving small channels of emptiness, barely noticeable at first, until one day I looked down and saw a canyon. I passed by shops without seeing them, heard voices without listening. My skin hummed with the need to be touched again, not out of lust, not for confirmation, but for that electric certainty I had only ever felt once or twice in my life. It terrified me that it had come from him. It terrified me more that I didn't regret it. By the time I returned to the villa, it was late afternoon. The house was quiet, the terrace empty. I walked through the kitchen and found a note on the counter. My husband had gone to meet someone for a coffee, a friend from school who happened to be nearby. He left a smiley face at the end of the note. I stared at it for a long time, then folded the paper and put it in the drawer beneath the wine glasses. I went upstairs, pulled the silk slip from the hanger, and changed slowly, deliberately. I brushed my hair, applied a soft scent behind my ears. The scent I hadn't worn in years. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't need to. The hallway outside my room was empty. I stepped toward the guest room, the one I had once pretended was just for afternoon rest. The door was ajar. I knocked lightly, not to announce myself, but as a warning, a ritual, a threshold. He opened the door. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We stood there, two people already undone, already in motion, already at the edge of something that couldn't be reversed. The silence between us was not absence. It was agreement. And then I stepped inside. There were no words, no conversation, no pretense of control, only breath. Only the sound of fabric sliding from skin, the echo of heat passing between us like a storm that had already touched ground. His hands were careful, but not hesitant. My mouth found his not out of hunger, but out of need. Slow, unhurried, devastating. Time folded inward. It wasn't passion that terrified me. It was how right it felt, how complete, how quiet, how familiar. When I returned to my room, the sky outside was beginning to darken. I stood at the window, arms crossed over my chest, and waited for the guilt to come. It didn't. Only stillness, only breath, only the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't pack right away. I walked from room to room in the villa like someone searching for something they knew they wouldn't find. My husband had returned just after sunset, full of idle details about his spontaneous meeting. He spoke quickly, distractedly, gesturing with his hands as though trying to animate the mundanity of his afternoon. I listened. I nodded. I even laughed once at something I didn't hear. But all the while, my mind was somewhere else, still in the room down the hall, still in the folds of skin and silence, in the weight of what we had crossed and what we had made in that space. He didn't notice the difference in me, or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. Some people will do anything to preserve the shape of something that looks intact from the outside, even if it's hollow inside, especially then. We ate together, all three of us, again, the final dinner. We had agreed to leave early the next morning, bags to pack, keys to return. My husband offered to make pasta. He liked the simplicity of it, said it was the most forgiving of foods. He hummed while he boiled water, smiled while he chopped herbs. He kissed my shoulder in passing. I smiled back, though the warmth of it didn't reach me. He didn't sit next to me that evening. He took the seat at the head of the table. Perhaps it was unintentional, or perhaps something in him had shifted, an unconscious reaction to a feeling he hadn't yet admitted to himself. He poured the wine, raised his glass in a casual toast to the best days we've had in a long time. I sipped. I watched the other man across from me, and for a moment I thought he would look up. But he didn't. He stared at his plate, shoulders relaxed, mouth set in a quiet line that betrayed nothing. The meal passed like fog. I don't remember the taste. Only the weight of every unspoken thing pressing down over the tablecloth. My husband spoke the most. He filled every silence. Asked questions, answered them himself, made jokes. He tried, without realizing it, to hold the structure of something already gone. Later, we all moved to the terrace. The wine bottles were nearly empty. The stars were beginning to gather above the sea. The air smelled of dry earth and night blooms. I sat alone in the far corner, legs folded beneath me, arms wrapped around my knees. The men sat opposite, side by side, feet on the rail, as if nothing had changed between them. But something had. And it was inside me. I watched their profiles against the dark. Two brothers. One who had loved me for years. The other who had seen something inside me I hadn't dared show anyone. One gave me structure. The other stripped it away. I didn't know which version of myself would leave this place in the morning. When the terrace grew too quiet, my husband excused himself and went to bed. He pressed his lips to the top of my head before going. "Don't stay up too late," he said softly. I nodded. Then it was just the two of us again. The second time that day. But this time we didn't touch. We sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the insects, the soft movement of wind over the hills. He lit a cigarette. I didn't know he smoked. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just needed something to do with his hands. Eventually, he turned to me and asked, barely above a whisper, "What happens now?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know. What I did know was that something had ended. Not just the illusion, not just the marriage, though that too, in ways neither of us had yet fully realized. What had ended was the life I'd been performing. The quiet choreography of compromise, the careful rituals of contentment, the routine of loving someone out of duty. I hadn't chosen this. Not the way people assume betrayal is chosen. I hadn't set out to unravel my life. But it had unraveled anyway, thread by thread, through glances, touches, silences that grew too full to ignore. And now it was done. We said nothing else. There was no point. He stood, put out the cigarette, and left me there. I watched him go. In the morning, we packed in silence. My husband moved easily, talking about traffic, the route back, whether we should stop at the bakery we liked along the coast. He asked me if I was okay. I said yes. He kissed my temple. I let him. We loaded the car together. He drove. His brother sat in the back. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the shoreline retreat in the mirror. No one cried. No one fought. No one spoke about what had happened. But everything had changed. And as the road curved inland, taking us away from the sea, I rested my head against the window, eyes wide open. And I let it all go.